29.
29.
We're discussing Windows 10 today.
Well, I mean,
You're not going to have us class you as the Antichrist, are you? By saying the M word.
Yeah. So my problem with Windows 10.
I'm just going to say this, that since 2008, I have not had to relearn how to use an operating system because of all the stuff moving around on me. Funny how that works.
You know, certainly since Windows XP, I'm not either.
The thing I've had problems with Windows 10 is my video card doesn't get updates through Windows 10 for some reason, and it doesn't want to accept the ones that it sends me. And I've had a couple of programs that didn't run on Windows 10 that gave it a conflict.
Oh, really? I didn't have any issue.
I really liked Windows XP actually when I was using it, and then they said you can't use Windows XP anymore. You have to have Vista. I looked at Vista, and I tell you, that's a great recruiting tool.
Yeah. You know what?
I would agree with that. Vista.
That's when I switched. I said, nope, I'm not learning how to do it all over again. If I have to learn something, I want to learn something.
Well, there were some bad versions of Windows. I will admit that. But if you waited to know, if you waited to know what which ones were stable, XP. A lot of companies are still using XP because it was so incredibly stable.
Windows are like Windows operating systems are kind of like Star Trek movies. Every even number,
not to make that same
every
point.
other one is bad, and
Windows 7 was very good, and Windows 10 is very good, but the ones in between there, yeah, I agree, there were some problems. My understanding is that Microsoft is really pushing Windows 10 because they plan to stay with it and just do minor updates. It's not something they're planning on updating every year or two. We'll see if that holds true or not.
Yeah, I think
like the
you said that,
Mac-verse.
Wayne, didn't you? It went on my thread.
I'm sorry.
Didn't you say that on the thread, Wayne?
No, I'm not on Preacher Talk.
Oh, okay. Oh, somebody. Yeah. Somebody mentioned that very point.
Oh, really?
About Windows 10 is supposed to. They're talking about keeping Windows 10 through like 2020. So.
He went out from among you.
What's that?
Wayne went out from among you.
Not one of us.
Yeah.
Hey, I left it too.
I go out from among people. I went out from Windows users. I went out from it's just a whole slew of things.
To me, there's one singular disadvantage to Windows 10, and I'm one of those rare users. I've got a computer at the house that I use Windows Media Center to record off the antenna, so that store all of our TV shows we want to watch, save money, and walk away from the big cable conglomerate. But Windows 10 automatically removes Media Center once you do the update.
I heard that. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that one computer will stay on Windows 7 until I quit using it, but all the other ones obviously are going up.
Right. Well, like I said, I'm going to do it while it's still free, which it ends in June. It's and I just got to find the right time to do the transition. That's the challenge here.
I did the same thing, Tom, anticipating the big learning curve, anticipating, I didn't want to do it on a Saturday night, when I might be wanting to review my materials or modify or update, or like on a Wednesday afternoon. But the reality is, as soon as it updated, everything went. It was just I picked right up and kept on going. So.
Tom, I do have to warn you. You use 2 monitors, right?
Yes.
Off a desktop, correct?
Yes.
All right. You've already got Windows 8 though installed, right?
Yes.
Make sure you update the graphic drivers to the most recent before you do it. All right. What happens is, and I remember reading about this after the fact and figured it out, but I had 3 monitors hooked up when I updated my Office to Windows 10, and it came up to a black screen. Long story short, if you don't update the graphics driver, it will default to the built-in monitor. I had to unhook all the monitors and plug up only one to the built-in graphics and not my graphics card. Once I did that, I could see something and finish the process.
Yeah.
And if
Mine didn't even do that. Mine worked right out of the box.
With a desktop or a laptop?
Desktop.
Desktop. Okay. Yeah, mine.
Yeah, and like I was saying a few minutes ago, I've had a few Windows 8 updates that did the same thing. I got one monitor, and then I had to just unplug everything. Matter of fact, it wasn't my primary monitor, so I had to unplug basically, and then just plug in the primary monitor. One of them's USB, and one of them, or not USB. One of them's HDMI, and one of them is whatever they call the blue cable with the two screws.
Yeah, VGA.
Yeah, VGA. Yeah, that's it. Yeah. Well, one of them's HDMI and one of them's VGA, and I had to unscrew, or I had to unplug the the HDMI one so that it would recognize the VGA, and then plug it back in, start at a time or two. Anyways, it is what it is.
Let's get underway.
Yeah, let's study the Bible a little bit.
But this is a Bible study.
Well, it's clearly a topic that's important to everybody, except for I'm waiting to hear in our chat here somebody about like what I got when I asked this question on Preacher Talk. Get a Mac.
No, that's just yeah.
Hey, well, my response to the get a Mac is I tell you what I'll do. I'm going to set up a GoFundMe account and ask for $5,000 so I can get a new Mac and a laptop. And when I raise that, then I'll be glad to switch over.
Don't forget, you've got to upgrade the logos as well.
Yeah, hey, well, that's not a problem. Logos upgrades. So it's included. But anyways,
I feel like it was a worthwhile investment for me, but
right.
It lasts.
There was a time in the computer history that it was without a doubt, if you had the money, the way to go. I mean, you go back to Windows 3.1, and you had preachers envious over the few that had Mac systems, and preachers were abandoning Windows right and left if they could afford it. But nowadays, it just depends on your software preference, I guess.
You could always go with Linux.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, that's the cheapskate way.
Speaking of the third choice out of the box, let's talk about some Bible today. That has nothing to do with third choice out of the box.
That should have been our first choice.
That's right. All right, bear with me just a moment. One more switch here. All right, here we're getting ready to begin. We're going to start with verse 29. We just didn't quite get that finished up last week. And then we'll finish up chapter 11, see if there's anything we need to review over it, and then step on into chapter 12 of 2 Corinthians. Sound good?
Sounds good.
All right. And 3, 2, 1. Greetings, I'm John Duvall. Welcome to another Truth Factor discussion. You know, the time each week we come together and discuss the Word of God and see how we can factor the truth into our daily lives and hopefully yours as well. If you're joining us for the first time, we want to let you know we'd love to have you participate in our study. We do have a built-in chat room that you can sign in using the guest option, or if you have a Chatroll account, you can use that, or even maybe Facebook if it works for you. And be sure to jump into our study. Let us know where you're from if this is the first time. If you have any questions or comments, we will be following that, and we'll bring them into our discussion as we go along. Gentlemen, it's good to see everyone this morning. I trust that there are no major problems in the world for any of y'all.
It's pretty broad.
Yeah, boy, it's hot out here. Pushing 90. I don't know what we're going to do.
Pretty soon y'all fall off into the ocean. So, see, that's why I live in the center part of the United States. You know, we could lose both East and West Coast, and I'll still be all right.
Yeah, right. Until the tornado picks up your house and takes it to the coast.
Or the earthquakes. We've got more earthquakes than California.
lately, exactly.
Yeah.
So, anyway.
All right. Well, speaking of shaking things up, let's talk about the Apostle Paul. And last week we talked about his charge, or not his charge, but his defense against those who were bringing charges against him. And we spent some time talking about him in a way that he would have rather not done it, kind of bragging on himself in verses 22 through 27, and showing to the people that the ones that they have chosen to listen to who were maligning the name of Paul and so forth, Paul has the credentials and the qualifications to warrant the brethren's trust and confidence, and not to listen to those others who were bringing these false charges against him. Were there any other thoughts or comments about what he went through as seen in verses 22 through 27?
Well, and I wasn't here last time. It seems to me that the big thrust of the boast is that the Corinthians would not have seen these as things to brag about. In the ancient world, when you suffered, it was something that was viewed as, you suffered because you did something bad and you must have deserved it. And so when Paul talks about how, I was in prison and beaten and in danger and shipwrecked and all, the Corinthians are commending things. They'd be like, why are you bragging about that? It's like bragging about today. But yet, that's Paul showing the foolishness of boasting and ultimately boasting in the Lord, as it says in 10:17.
That's right, yeah. Any thoughts or comments about that? And we in our life today, I can't really see any preachers being called upon to boast in a similar fashion.
Right.
Most
Nowadays,
don't need any. Most people don't need much prompting.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. But like we did discuss last week, kind of in reviewing leading up to this, because we got a couple of more examples of it. The idea of people establishing their credentials, we still see that today.
Speaking of credentials, I wanted to ask Wayne this. Wayne, your college education, what did you get up to?
Me? I got a master's degree.
Okay, guys, we've just elevated the show by one notch. Anyone else with a master's in theology?
I don't like to bring it up a lot, but
well, like we said, we had to ask.
You had to ask.
We have an engineer in our midst, an IT guy in our midst, a teacher in our midst, a retired military guy, sort of. How about you, Brian? Remind me again.
My background's in law.
There you go. Ooh,
okay. We got a lawyer.
Yeah. Anyway, now, I'm sorry. I thought about that when we were talking about it, and I didn't have a chance to ask you, Wayne. So I was just curious about that.
Oh, okay. Well, there you go.
But notice our bios don't go into great details of our past, so.
No.
Yeah, normally so.
We count it as nothing, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. Paul boasted in a way that was necessary, I think, to try to get the people to listen to him. We're not faced with the same things today, the same circumstances, I would think. How many of us, in describing what we've gone through as a Christian, could list such hardships that Paul has gone through?
John, I think sometimes, though, preachers struggle with the difference between, as Paul is pointing out, perhaps a credential of his suffering. A lot of preachers just like to complain about the way brethren have treated them or problems they've had, and of course, in such circumstances, it's not an appropriate conversation.
But complaining is different than boasting.
You're right, but you might be saying the exact same things. The brethren treated me like this or that. And, it could be the same kind of words, but a different intent and purpose.
And sometimes complaining about the brethren is done simply for the purpose of elevating self. By putting other people down, we necessarily exalt ourselves.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
How many people would, like Paul did, sort of point to the fact that as proof of their genuineness as a preacher, they've been fired twice?
Yeah. Well, yeah.
And sometimes that's proof. Sometimes it's not.
Right.
Exactly. And I can imagine somebody that went through everything that Paul endured according to this. Making sure everybody knew that they had endured these things.
Well, If a preacher was to tell me that, I've been fired from 2 or 3 congregations for teaching the truth. I only taught the truth and they couldn't stand the truth. I would say to myself, there's 2 sides to that story.
Yeah, what is true?
I'll either believe or disbelieve what you're telling me. With Paul, there's no 2 sides to the story.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, in a lot of times, of course, it's designed. I don't think Paul's. Do you really see Paul getting fired from the places he's preaching from?
No,
he's
that
getting
wasn't
attacked
a good
by
example.
he gets attacked by outsiders.
Yeah.
Because he proclaims the truth, and some people convert and some people don't. There's never as far as I know, it's where Paul, the brethren just say, "Oh, Paul, we've had enough of you. We're going to throw you out and not pay you anymore," which, of course, they couldn't do because they weren't paying him in the first place. He was taking money from other churches. But instead what happens is, Paul's like, "I'm going to show up and discipline you if you don't get your act together."
Yeah.
It seems, if anything, that Paul's presence in the Corinthian churches is demanded by the problems, not him being driven away from it. So, it's just an observation, more or less.
Hang on a second here.
I mean, one other thing I think would be worth noting, is, people still boast according to the flesh today. I mean, when I was in India, for instance, sometimes this comes up. People will introduce themselves. I was in one class, and people were introducing themselves. "Oh, I have my degree in this. I have master's degree in this. I have doctorate degree in this." People would come up to me and introduce themselves that way, and just kind of in the back of my head wondering, why is that how you start conversations?
Yeah. Well,
Is that a cultural?
But then, no, that's the thing. I mean, I think there's a sense in which they really are trying to. Not everyone does that, but there were certain preachers, I think, that were doing that, and it was because I think they are a little bit caught up in themselves, very similar to what in the ancient world even. Of course, there are other preachers who, you wouldn't know it. They don't bring it up all the time, but they've suffered for the cause of Christ. I know one man, for instance, who I work with, who, he went to a village, he preached the gospel, and some people came in from the Hindu party, and they beat him up and said, "Don't come back here." They drove him out of town. That's clearly an instance of what you see, the kind of stuff.
Look at the sharp contrast here between what Paul states and then what John talks about in the actions of Diotrephes. There's such a sharp contrast to that. Diotrephes wanted preeminence. Paul's just showing that through the simplicity of preaching the truth, he suffered a great deal of things. It's like we suggested last week. There isn't any of us on this panel that would sign up to take these classes in persecution. We're not about to do that. But let's not lose sight, and I may be jumping ahead or pushing this ahead, I don't know, but at verse 28, let's not lose sight of the greatest difficulty he had, and that was the care of all these churches that he'd worked with. They were so easily moved away from the stability of Christ at Corinth. Well, what's to stop the other churches that he'd worked with from being moved away from the stability of Christ? This was Paul's greatest concern, much more than suffering all these physical abnormalities.
Mm-hmm. That's true.
Do you suppose that he says in Galatians 6, this whole chapter in one statement, when he says, "From now on, let no one cause me trouble, for I bear on my body the marks of Jesus"? In other words, I've got scars to prove my sincerity. Back off.
Badges of honor. Badges of honor.
That's a good point. That's a good point. Well, let's go ahead and read beginning in verse 28, and we'll read down through the end of the chapter, and then that'll kind of set us up for a discussion of this. So let's see. Let me get that ready. And who has Paul? I'll throw it to you if you'd like to read that.
I'll be happy to.
You feel up to reading with your. I noticed your voice was a little bit.
We'll begin 1 Corinthians 11 in verse 28, did you say, John?
Yes, and we'll read down to the end of the chapter.
All right. The scripture says there, besides the other things, what comes upon me daily, my deep concern for all the churches, who is weak? And am I not weak? Who is made to stumble? And do I not burn with indignation? If I must boast, I will boast in the things which concern my infirmity. The God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who is blessed forever, knows that I am not lying. In Damascus, the governor, under Aretas the king, was guarding the city of Damascus with a garrison, desiring to arrest me. But I was let down in a basket through a window in the wall, and escaped from his hands. And I hope I didn't butcher those names too badly.
You did fine. I appreciate it. You did as good as I could have done, Paul. How about that? All right. So, and this has already been pointed out earlier, what he says in verse 28. And the English Standard Version kind of separates it, whereas the New King James continues within the line of thought there. But the new ESV says, and apart from other things, there's the daily pressure on me of my anxiety for all the churches. And as I think, Mike, you were pointing out, that really that was what was the greatest challenge that Paul faced. It wasn't the beast at Ephesus that he had to fight. It was ultimately his worry and concern for the congregations, for the brethren.
Well, I agree. And as an aside, I've always wondered whether the beast at Ephesus were 2 legs or 4. What Paul endured is just absolutely beyond our understanding. We've never encountered anything like this physically, and I would dare say emotionally. Have we received threats? Certainly. Have we received persecutions in various forms? Certainly. I came home one night and saw the side of my car mashed in by a brother, or not, by an individual, I should say, that just didn't want us around. But nothing compares to what Paul endured, especially with the fact that all these churches, and maybe we need to explain, these aren't denominations talking about.
Right.
These are local churches of Christ that Paul has either established by preaching there or has built up by being there in some fashion. And his concern for the brethren, it might be better translated that the concern that comes upon him daily is the care of all the brethren that he knows. Each individual Christian became a great concern to him as to their stability in Christ. We tend today to put that in the lap of the elders. Some congregations put that in the laps of the preachers. But the fact is, if we love one another with pure hearts fervently, as we're supposed to, we're concerned about each other as brethren, just as we're concerned about each other as a physical family.
Yeah.
You know, if a child was missing, you wouldn't wait till the next Sunday to find out why they were missing. If someone was sick, you wouldn't wait a month to take them to the doctor. Spiritually, we need to have, I believe, a greater acquaintance with the brethren that we worship with and work with than we do any other people on earth.
That's a good point, Mike. That's a good point. And often the sad thing is, by the time you visibly begin to realize someone's been missing services, the problem has already gotten to a point that is almost unrepairable, because it began before they quit coming. You know, this is just kind of the final stages of it, and it's harder to repair. You know.
I got a question for you guys on the translation issue here. What is it that you're seeing that's making you think that in verse 28 he's saying that this pressure or anxiety is greater than the other? It looks like in the ESV it just says apart from other things, there's also this daily pressure, but I don't see why we're picking up on that being somehow a worse burden than the other things.
I don't think it's worse. I just think it's more important.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I would say the reason I view it that way is because in my mind, certainly it would be the greater concern. You know, I mean, the spiritual versus a beating here or there. I mean, you know, not to be flippant about the beating here or there, or those kind of things. But I mean, I mean, how many of us with whatever we're going through now grieve at the direction that we see the Lord's church going in some instances. You know, just the progressive attitude. And honestly, along with that, my concern about what we're going to be facing in the course of the next 10 to 20 years, if that long. I mean, the gauntlet is being laid down, you know, by a nation that is in no means a Christian nation, and it never has been. I fully understand that, which is why I'm making that point. Because we think we're going to turn it back into a godly nation by voting on candidate X.
Well,
ain't going to happen. It's not going to happen. And but churches are about to start paying a price when they stand for the whole truth and preach on it.
Well,
have any of you
that's
ever
a concern to me.
had a congregation where you worked for in the past that made decisions that grieved you later, as Paul did?
I can't think of one specifically. No.
I think with Paul it is very personal. I mean, he's upset with the Galatians where he says, I can't believe where you've gone, or and it seems that the Thessalonians, Corinthians, all these groups he's worked with, and then he's gone and they make decisions that just utterly rip him apart. Tear him up.
Oh yeah, well, and of course you look at Paul, and you look at the churches that he's responsible for establishing. And I'm sure he takes that very personal. I have not had that experience. Call it a blessing, if you, or a curse, or whatever. I have not had the depth of experience that Paul has had in starting congregations, and things such as that. I've gone to congregations that were established. Like I said, that's not necessarily a. It's not necessarily a compliment. Not necessarily a condemnation. Everybody's different. But I can understand Paul. I was responsible for all these congregations being established, and I'm very concerned that they're doing that which is right. So,
Eric, what's your thoughts on this, since you kind of asked the question there?
Oh, I'm enjoying listening to you guys. When I had read that, I didn't pick up on him saying this was somehow worse than everything else. I just wondered if maybe it was something that I was missing. That's all.
Yeah, I just kind of think in all the things that he had to go through, this was something on a daily basis. You think about maybe a daily pressure, not the random occasional problem, but
on top of that, there seems there's an implicit rebuke of the Corinthians here again, because here we are. The opponents have likely been using Paul's sufferings to kind of denigrate him, knock him down a level or two, and Paul just kind of throws this in at the end. By the way, the whole reason I go through this is for you guys. Yeah. It's the whole reason that Paul suffers is because he puts others before himself, because he puts these congregations before himself, including the church at Corinth. Yeah. And that's, that ought to be, that ought to kind of, it's you guys, it's for you guys that I'm doing this. Paul could have done a lot of things that wouldn't have involved suffering, but he chooses the suffering because it's a benefit to these churches.
Yeah, right. And how much is it some of these congregations going along with that? How much is it some of them cause him to grieve more than he should have to if they were behaving themselves?
Go ahead, Paul. What were you saying?
I was going to say that certainly we've given several warnings, and I'll keep this very brief, but we've given several warnings about preachers not boasting in an arrogant and proud way. But there is a reality there that we need to see the value in the work that we do and not be ashamed of that. I don't mean to pat ourselves on the back or to be arrogant about it, but Paul says, I suffer these things. I think someone said it right, because of my concern for you. He doesn't hesitate to just let that be known that I care so much about you. I care about the Lord's work, about what's going on with you, so much that I'm willing to suffer these kind of things. And we might, in a similar way, just let folks know that, we're busy with many things in our lives, and the reason we are is because we love the Lord's work, and not to undermine or play down in some kind of either faux humility or real lack of self-worth or the worth of what we do, but to realize that there is great value in the work that preachers do.
That's a valid point. And I think kind of what we're leaning towards is the motivating cause behind some of the boasting, you know. But that's a good point. Wayne, with what you were saying just a moment ago, do you think verse 29 factors into that? Who is weak?
Who is weak?
Yeah.
Yeah. I noticed that Paul's, when he was reading, his version read a little differently than mine. Mine says, New American Standard, who is weak without my being weak? Who is led into sin without my intense concern? Or literally, I think that says, who is led into sin without me being burned by it, basically. It's kind of, Paul was living that whole principle of 1 Corinthians 12, that when one member of the body suffers, the whole body suffers with it. Well, when these people in these churches suffer, that falls on Paul. And so he suffers along the catalog of sufferings, how that has manifested itself in reality.
That is interesting. Who is weak without my being weak, and who is led into sin without my intense concern. That makes a bit more sense than the New King James and even the ESV in some way.
Well, I mean, the Greek is very, very strange. And I was caused to stumble. It's just translate it literally, and yes, most of the. I mean, but I think some of the older versions just kind of render it with that literal reading, and the idiom seems to be more who is in this situation without my also being affected by it, basically.
Interesting. All right. Any other thoughts on that? Wayne was having a little bit of internet issue, and so at least from my end, you're kind of breaking up there on some of the discussion. But we were able to get enough of what you were saying there, I think, to understand what you're saying there, and it seems to settle down. Any thoughts or comments? I mean, the way that Wayne had kind of suggested in the New American Standard Version's rendering of it tends to fit just a little bit better than, who is weak and I'm not weak. It's like you say you're weak, but I'm weak, and who is made to fall and I'm not indignant. It's interesting.
Well, one thing we've seen from earlier studies in this same chapter is that when there were problems, Paul couldn't rest. He was, disturbed, and I'm thinking of modern applications of that I fortunately have not had to experience this in an extreme amount. We've had some difficulties where I've been, but we've been able to work through them. But I have known I've known preachers who left the work because of the impact on them personally of trouble and maybe what they felt was personal rejection and that kind of thing, who just gave up preaching completely. And it can be an enormous strain on someone to have to be around people, especially people who they counted as family, who turn on them. And I think Paul is experiencing that in this letter. People he had loved, people he had given himself for, and now he's experiencing them questioning his sincerity or his integrity. And we probably could not overstate the strain that would be on any one of us to experience.
That's a good point. That's a good point. All right. Any other thoughts about this up to verse 29? All right. So he says in verse 30, then, if I must boast, I'll boast of the things that show my weakness. The God and Father of the Lord Jesus, he who is blessed forever, knows that I am not lying. So if Paul's going to boast in anything, he says he's going to boast in those things that actually accentuate his weaknesses, not his strengths.
It's interesting. There's another place where he says boast in the cross or glory in the cross. And so if we boast about the cross, what are we boasting in except our own sinfulness and weakness? And so that's an interesting, if we're going to brag about something, brag about what the mercy and grace that God has shown to us. And we can't do that without making ourselves look small by comparison.
And I still see the Paul Paul in pain as he says this or whatever. You know, I somewhat see sarcasm even in that statement. You know, or driving home the point of everything that he's been dealing with. I have. You know, if I got to brag about something, it's going to be in these types of things. You've forced me to boast, which I don't want to do. But if I do, since I had to, these are the things I am going to talk about, and these are things that establish him from the standpoint of his faithfulness and so on.
Okay. Let's see.
I think Wayne was going to say something like that.
Oh, well, I remember one of my teachers one time said that boasting in the cross is like boasting about your Uncle Joey who got hanged for stealing horses. And so there's a certain degree of shame that comes with that and social stigma that is kind of lost on us today.
In their setting, you mean?
Yeah. In their setting, it would be like if we boasted that we had this uncle somewhere who got hanged for stealing horses. You know.
Especially if we lived in a time period where you were hanged for stealing horses.
Yeah, I know. It was a dated reference comment, but still, I mean.
Well, in the boasting, we see, I've seen about Acts 5 there where you see they were before the council, and I'm trying to look back and remember for sure. I think it was Peter, and it may have been John. I'm not sure. I have to search a little bit. But it says in verse 41, so they departed from the presence of the council, rejoicing that they were counted worthy to suffer shame for his name. They saw it as an honor or something boast-worthy to suffer shame for the cause of Christ. That seems to be what Paul is indicating. He gets to suffer for Christ. He's becoming like Christ.
All right, here's an odd question, Paul. Do you think that there's a difference between Paul's attitude, that is, the Apostle Paul's attitude, and I'm asking the Paul present this question.
Okay.
Do you think there's a difference between Paul's attitude and what we would typically call martyrism or the mindset of a martyr?
Paul anticipates that he's going to be a martyr, but
Okay.
But I don't know that. If you're talking about like a martyr syndrome, woe is me. Anything? No, I just think it's that here I've lived my faith to such a degree that it has caused suffering to come about. Peter wrote about that. If anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed.
Mm-hmm.
Let him glorify God on that behalf or in this name.
Okay.
We can bring glory to God in that. It's not a personal exaltation. It's just something that in our lives we are sometimes allowed to do.
Okay. All right. I don't know if the question even had much merit. I mean, there may be one and the same, but sometimes we hear about a martyr, we hear about someone who's dying for a cause, but as Paul is not dying for a cause, he's dying because of his faith and love for God.
But he's living for the cause first, too. I mean,
That's true.
He suffers in the fashion he does because, as far as he's concerned, he's already dead, and he's just given his life to the cause. So whether he's alive physically or dead physically, is irrelevant. He's doing everything for Christ. People with martyr complexes that, like you're talking about, they tend to have, this psychological need. Like they can somehow justify themselves internally if they suffer at the hands of others, regardless of whether or not they suffer for doing anything wrong. Sometimes martyr complex is simply an attempt to avoid responsibility.
Okay.
The Bible, like 1 Peter, for instance, talks several times it's better to suffer for doing what is right than for doing what is wrong. There's a clear difference between them. And in Paul's case, his suffering is simply a consequence of the fact that he's in Christ, and it's part of his attempt to imitate Christ. It's not based on some psychological need for sympathy or validation from others. It's simply his desire to be conformed to God.
I have to say, I'm learning I'm learning a new word today. I don't know about martyr complex, but when I just typed it into Google, I misspelled it as Marty complex, and the Urban Dictionary first response is Marty McFly complex. I'm assuming that's a different thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
You are my density.
That makes sense. Okay.
Martyr complex. There it is. I see it now.
Yeah, guess what I'm looking up right now.
Oh dear. Okay. Anyone else want to throw themselves down on the axe and make a comment about that?
Wow.
Wayne, I appreciate your comments. I wish I had said all that before, but I didn't. And I really like that explanation that because I really think oftentimes that's what it is. That's we have Fox's books of martyr, and I understand the point behind that, but Paul wasn't a martyr for Christ. As you said, he was living for Christ, and yes, he was willing to die for Christ, but it's different. I think it's different.
And Paul avoided suffering when he could.
Yeah.
Oh. Always playing the Roman citizen card. Yeah.
Yep.
Of course, that wouldn't have meant much.
32 and 33 are about too.
What's that?
You think that's what verses 32 and 33 are about? That Paul wasn't looking for martyrdom.
I hadn't thought about that. I wish I had, because that would have seemed a bit smarter. But Brian, that's a good point. He leads right into an example of him escaping. Go ahead.
What kind of baskets did they have is what I wonder, too. I mean, that must
Maybe he was a little guy.
Yeah.
Well, okay, you think about it. If you think about it from this standpoint, let's say houses in the walls or homes within the walls would have been, I don't know, 10, 20, 30 feet off the ground. It may have been easier for them to get laundry out, to get supplies in and out without carrying them up and down. So maybe that was a normal means of getting things in and out of the window.
Mm.
And so they would have had baskets heavy enough, Not purely speculating on that, obviously, but
I was just thought it's an odd statement to kind of throw in here at the end after all that to kind of bring it up, and I always sit here wondering what's the significance of putting this after these other big points.
Yeah, I mean, we tend to think of like getting stoned would be a bigger deal than escaping a city in a basket. Yeah. I think some of the significance is built into the insignificance of it, because it's not so much that it's an example of persecution, so much as that it's embarrassing. Paul to throw people in jail and arrest them, and then gets chased out of town like he's a criminal. He comes as persecutor, leaves as persecuted. Instead of climbing the wall to scale the city and invade it, he scales down the wall and runs away. I mean, you'd be like, well, Paul, why didn't you stand and face your fears? Why'd you run away? What is this, a cowardice on his part? He says, no, this is what the way of Christ has become for me. It's become a place where there is really a way of escape, but it's through shame and suffering and defeat and possible death anyway.
Do you think verses 30 and 2 is the weakness he's referencing in verse 30? I'll boast of the things that show my weakness. God knows I'm not lying. I was let down out of a basket through a window and escaped.
That is kind of shameful. I think that fits, Wayne, when you put it that way. It does sound, it's not something you'd be bragging about. That makes sense.
No. Well, nothing on this list is something you really should be bragging about. But
that's how it fits.
Right. I mean, Paul's kind of making a mockery of the fact that they're boasting. This whole speech in 2 Corinthians 11 is basically, is showing how stupid it is to boast according to the flesh, and how absurd. I mean, he's answering the fools according to their folly, really.
Okay. All right. Any other thoughts or comments on that? We talked about the potential basket and the weakness and Paul's point. All right. Any other thoughts on this? Anything else we need to look at in regards to chapter 11? Okay.
There you go. There's the basket.
Oh.
Yeah, that was some basket, like I said.
Here, Paul, click on your picture. Bring it back up there.
I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. That's pretty cool. That's a good likeness of Paul.
Yeah. That's the apostolic trading cards I have. Show me what they look like.
John, just before we finish this, I'm hopeful that this is appropriate. I really believe that, especially as we preachers mingle with the works, the separate congregations that we labor with, one of the emphasis that brethren need to understand is that there's not some superiority to the preacher. There's not, though elders have leadership, there's not some superiority that we put them up on a throne above us. We are to esteem them highly and love for their work's sake, certainly. But I believe that to factor this into our lives, which continues to be our theme in this study, we need to understand how loving Paul was toward the brethren at Corinth. And it's, to me, he's trying to pull their heart to his as well, that they might have this same love, care, and attention one toward another. When Peter talks about our fervent love one toward another, he's not talking about an acknowledgement of who you are and where you live. He's talking about the absolute understanding of one another's needs in order to keep them in the faith and in the work of our God. There's so many brethren that, at least this is my opinion, so take it for what it's worth, but there seems to be a great many brethren who look at the Lord's church and their service within it with absolutely no more care and dedication than they would to a local civic organization. That's wrong. The Lord's church is the children of God, and if children, then heirs, and joint heirs with Christ, and that makes us brethren. Yeah. If our physical brethren and sisters are in need, we're going to come to that attention. If they're wrong, we're going to come to that attention. That's the kind of repertoire that Paul, I believe, is seeking from Corinth, and that we need to exemplify and really grasp within each local work.
That's a good point. Very good point. Any other thoughts on that? All right. I've got a completely side question that's been on my mind for the last few minutes in some of our discussions, or more of an observation. It is interesting where, how to put this, the way the whole preacher system works nowadays. Okay, someone wants to go and interview for a congregation, and the congregation, kind of like a business, listens to the fella and decides the pros and cons of having the person and decides whether or not to hire the person. You know, then the person might look for another, or a congregation will go up to the preacher and say, we think you've been here long enough for such and such reasons, we want someone else, and so we're going to give you 6 months to a year. It's hard to imagine that having gone on back then, you know. Right. And I understand that at time, and there is some evolution of effect, if you would, because we have to fill in where the Bible doesn't in matters pertaining to what we're talking about, where we're allowed to do that at least. But it's hard to imagine the church in Ephesus telling Timothy, you know, we appreciate you working with us, but we're wanting Titus to come work with us now. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it is what we live in today and what we function in, but it's just interesting to observe the difference. Yeah.
I mean, I think there's a couple of key differences. You know, first of all, they didn't have this idea that they were limited to one evangelist. I mean, I think it's hard to find examples where there's just one guy working in one place and no one else is there. At the same time, it seems, you know, that it's more about who's living in a particular area and working with that congregation. Paul, of course, he doesn't take money from the Corinthians, but takes money from others. Apparently, so he will not be beholden to them, and so that, you know, there will be no strings attached they have no real power over him as a congregation. They can't just say, well, you can't be part of this church anymore. It's like he started this group, and he's going to preach here whether you want him to or not. So, I mean, that kind of mentality definitely seems like a huge contrast. Yes.
One thing I think
interesting.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Brian.
I was talking to my neighbor yesterday. It just so happens that my house is next door to the parsonage for the United Methodist Church in town. So we're on our third Methodist pastor at the moment that they moved. But it's interesting. He said this is the time of year when they talk about moving, and they have a process in place. But there's a guy, I don't know his title, but there's a guy who's over the region. I don't know if it's a synod or what the right terminology is. And, the church has some say, the pastor has some say, and then there's this guy, he decides ultimately who goes where. And so they can move people where they want them to be. And we almost see Paul playing that role in the New Testament because he sends Timothy and Titus, you go here, you go there. But the fact is that we don't have that role in today, not having an apostle like Paul here. So we have to, as you said, but you used the word evolution, which I was surprised with. But we have to come up with a way of figuring out who's going to work where, and we're left to sort of our own judgment on that, I suppose.
The process evolved. Okay, I need to delete that from the recording. That may come back to haunt me later. Go ahead, Brian.
One thing I wonder, I think a lot of times today among churches in America anyway, my experience is that we don't look at the preacher as a qualified office within the church like we might look at an elder or a deacon. I've always felt that 2 Timothy chapter 2 gives a list of qualifications, a lot of which are the same qualifications that are with elders and deacons, these things, but we don't look at it that. We do look at the preacher as more of a hireling, and that's certainly not the scriptural view of those things, and that perhaps if we did look at it more like we're looking at the works of elders or deacons, that a qualified person to do a specific work in the church might change the way we treat evangelists in congregations too.
Oh, I agree with that, Brian. And there is where Paul talks about to Timothy, do the work of an evangelist. While it's not in all an office within the church, it is a work, and there are qualifications for that work.
Yeah.
I know a lot of times people say, well, if you've gone to a certain preaching school or gone through a certain preaching program somebody offers, you're qualified to be a preacher. And I cringe at that because I'm afraid it doesn't really look to what the scriptures say are the qualities or qualifications an evangelist should have to do that work.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. There was a book I had, I think I may have gotten rid of it. It was an old book called Brano the Iconoclast. And I have no idea what the book was about, other than I read through portions of it. But he was talking about religious schools. And it wasn't a member of the church who wrote the book, but he was talking about how the Methodists, they'll have a conveyor belt and a stamp. And so they'll have preachers stamped out and come, and the Lutherans from their schools, and and different religious organizations will stamp out preachers to that they wanted to look like them teach. And I think there's a bit of truth to that. If you're not careful, depending on what you require of the evangelist, did you go here, did you go there, did you have this type of training? You may be looking for a particular mold. Not someone to come and teach the truth, but someone who fits a mold that you're expecting.
Right.
And so, okay. Well, I've got one more question to ramble on. If someone has any other thoughts, real quick. I ran across a fellow years ago who wrote his own little commentary on 1 Corinthians. And he took the position that a preacher's wife had to be a Christian. That if a preacher's wife, if she was not a Christian, then he could not be a preacher of the gospel. And it's because of Paul's statement about Peter having the right to have a believing wife. And from that statement, he drew the conclusion that you couldn't preach unless your wife was a believer.
Maybe you just can't bring her along.
Context.
Yeah.
Context.
Yeah, I don't think you can get that out of that passage.
Has anybody ever met a preacher that his wife wasn't a believer?
Yeah.
I mean, I've never met anyone. I've met preachers who are divorced, but I mean, it does raise a question. You know, I mean, what woman would marry a man who chose to do that for a living if she herself were not a believer? And maybe there's someone who would do that. I don't know, but you know,
he could have been a convert. He could be a convert, right?
No, he might convert, and then yeah, that's possible too. I mean, you know, I mean, there's situations. I'm trying to think how. I'm just trying to even imagine how that scenario would even come up in the first place, because it seems like the people I know no one who's in that situation, but I know several preachers who are divorced. So yeah. It's kind of like, what do we do with that?
I don't know.
Unbelieving wife departed, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, it could be the case where someone, you know, we talk about women marrying men who aren't Christians, but maybe a man decides to marry a woman who's not a Christian, and 15 years down the road, he keeps plugging along, and he decides, you know, I'd like to preach, you know, and so he decides to start preaching. She never goes to services with him. She goes to her own church, and it's like he's just changing occupations.
Brian, if you know two of these scenarios, is there a way you can say without revealing anything too personal, like the basic setting of that?
Yeah, well, one after he was married, he converted, and I should be careful to say they're not. I don't like the term full time, but I would say they're not employed with congregations as evangelists, but they do the work. With multiple congregations, and one of them is very effective. He's a very good preacher, but his wife is simply not a believer. And then the other one I know, he was a believer, and he married an unbeliever, and then kind of solidified his faith to a degree. And with him, it was interesting because the conversation he had was that somebody said no congregation will ever hire you as an evangelist as long as your wife is not a believer. And so he didn't really pursue too hard to have a work support him full time.
Practical point that I'll just make is that it would be very hard for me to be engaged in a local work if you want to use the term full time, giving full effort to the gospel without my wife. It would just be incredibly difficult. I'm not saying it's unscriptural for a man to preach who may have an unbelieving wife, or even for a congregation to ask a man to come work with him, knowing that his wife would not be a part of that. But I just, from a purely practical standpoint, I don't know how I would be able to do it.
Well, Paul, you've probably read this from me, and I know John heard it. I said it from the pulpit down in Oklahoma when I was there. I'm satisfied that every work I've ever enjoyed with brethren through 40-some years of doing this, I'm satisfied that all of those brethren hired Nancy and just let me do the preaching. And I just couldn't do any of this without Nan.
Well, and you bring up an interesting point, and I hear this in prayers sometimes, frequently. People will say that Eric and Sarah labor here or whatever. There is this concept of sort of hiring the couple. I don't know if that's an interesting concept, and I've thought about that before, and I've thought that might deserve some kind of study and introspection. Is that an accurate way of looking? Are you hiring the family, or even if hire is the right word? Some people would say hire is the wrong word, but are you supporting? And I guess you are supporting the family, but does that mean the children are working there too? And
yeah, you absolutely are. And I
was in a workshop a few months ago, and there were two different guys. Question kind of. One of them said, he says, absolutely, I see my wife as like a full partner. This is a 50-50 deal. You hire me, you hire my wife. And the other guy said, if you're going to hire my wife and expect her to do stuff, then you better pay her a salary.
Ooh,
wow.
And so that was interesting back and forth. I mean, there's no real consensus on that at all.
Right. And
even in a thing like that, instead of like that, I thought it was interesting to listen to.
Yeah.
I think that maybe might be some kind of happy medium between those two positions, but I don't know.
Right.
No.
But that's suggesting the wife would do nothing
If she
towards the
was
work of
right.
the church. I mean,
Well, I mean, the idea that was being put across is that if you're going to hire the preacher but have all these extra expectations of his wife,
Yeah.
you better
okay.
pay the wife for those extra expectations,
Gotcha.
or you better not have them. One of the
I
two.
understand what Mike was saying about the assistance his wife provides. I agree with that. My wife, if for no one else, she makes me able to do the work that I do. Someone to be at home with and private and be able to talk to, and someone who supports the work that I do helps me to see.
Yeah.
Well, and like you, Paul, if I've got concerns on my mind, Nan's the one I'll sound them off on to find out what her take is on it, as to whether or not I need to proceed in that, or change the letter, or change the way I talk to somebody.
But,
She's a good sounding board for that. And you talk about a good PR person, that's my wife. And I think that all of us that are married and working in this capacity, we have to say that about our wives. They're better looking than we are to start with.
Well, in addition, though, I wanted to make another point, and that is that I know of multiple preachers who have trouble staying any place very long because of their wives not being helpers in that work. Instead, they're just the opposite.
They're
They're-
hindrances.
They stir up struggles there, and you probably know those situations too.
Right. Yeah.
And I remember when I was first considering going into preaching, people talked to Sarah. I thought this was very helpful, but some other preachers' wives would see me somewhere, and they would talk to Sarah, and there's a special struggle that maybe we don't appreciate of being a preacher's wife, and there's a lot of pressures and things that come with that, and that would be an interesting topic to dive into sometime. I don't know.
Right. Yeah. To give my for what it's worth.
Sorry.
I never totally thought about it, but it perfectly makes sense that in the prayer, and it's done here for us. Be with him and his family as they labor with us. I mean, you can't separate them. You absolutely cannot separate the wife from the husband. Not now. Now the expectation, that's another issue. I'm talking about from the standpoint of, if you expect the wife to be down at the building and be the one that's going to clean the building and make and bake the communion bread, and be the woman that's beck and called for when another woman in the congregation has a struggle, then she's the one you expect to. Then like you said, I mean, if you're going to hire her, but I mean the treatment of that type of an idea. So I definitely see the idea of praying for the family, because they come and go together.
There's a lot we could talk about in just regards to this.
Right.
I've told of a story one time. A preacher, the men asked the preacher to, once a week or twice a week to water some trees they had planted and everything, and he would have to drag the water hose. And he basically, as it was reported to me, so this may not be true, but it was reported to me, refused to do that, saying that wasn't in his job description.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So, I mean, thing is, we're dealing with people.
Yeah.
And
you got an attitude problem that's bigger there.
Well, here's the thing. Go back to who was it talking about the difference between I think it might have been Mike, but the difference between the office and a work. Okay. A preacher is a member of a congregation like all the other members are. Now, he does have a very specific responsibility, but that doesn't preclude him from helping out in the other areas. I mean, I'm not put on the yard mowing list because I'm a special man. No, it's just that we have enough young men to do it. They don't need me to do it. But I'd be happy to get out there and mow the yard if needed be. But there have been some whose mindset is I'm hired to preach and I'm going to preach, and that's all that I'm supposed to do.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, guys, I took us past the hour with this. I do appreciate all your thoughts and comments on it. And to me, these are the real problems that sometimes preachers either bring on themselves or they face. You know, Paul had his challenges that he had to deal with, and sometimes we either cause the problems ourselves. And I like the discussion about the preacher's wife, and what Eric said, that might be an interesting study at some point, just to kind of talk about that.
It may not be appropriate to. It'd be interesting to have our wives give input in some way to that. It'd be interesting.
Oh, that wouldn't be scriptural to have them on camera, would it?
They could sit right off camera, though, right?
Put them in the chat room.
I was going to say before my.
Did you see every once in a while something like this happens to me?
I was going to say before my phone rang that Eric's comment was right on target, because whether we think it's right or scriptural or ought to be that way or anything else, our wives are held to a higher standard than the average
Yes, they are.
lady in the congregation.
Yeah.
They are. Like
told
working
my
in a.
wife, some cold evenings, Sunday evenings, or even Sunday mornings, wear a pair of slacks. It is just too cold. And she'd look very presentable. I'm not saying holy jeans or anything, but as in with holes in them. But but a nice pair of dress slacks, and a sweater. I said it'll be fine. She goes, no. People, whether I think so or not, she senses that she has to set a certain level that no one else might be thought negatively of. And that's just one minor example, but they are held to a higher standard.
That's right. That's right. All right. Let's see. Any other thoughts or comments on this? We've had our own little chat going in our private chat room. I see if there's anything there that we might want to bring out, but we're about five after.
Well, for a future topic, it would be interesting I would like to hear you guys' thoughts too on you use the word hire and interview and those. But there's some interesting thoughts about the relationship between the evangelist and the congregation, and the evangelist and the elders, and it's not like a normal employee-employer relationship. But I'd like to dive into that. Maybe between books we can do some topical studies like that.
That'd be a good idea. I mean, think about how many members in the congregation can the elders go up to and say, "Well, we appreciate you working with us here, but we're ready for you to move on." Right. That's a good point. All right. Well, we'll try to remember. I think it'll be an interesting discussion. Very much so. All right. Well, let's plan next week to pick up with chapter 12, verse 1. Does that sound good? Everybody? All right.
Sounds good to me.
All right. Well, let's see. Any other final thoughts or comments? Let's start with you, Brian.
No, I think not. I think we brought out some really great points on this, and look forward to actually getting into chapter 12 next week. That's one of particular interest to me.
Absolutely, definitely. I was glad we couldn't make it into, because we wanted to spend some time with that third heaven stuff. And Eric, any thoughts or comments?
I know a man who plans to be here next week to join in.
Okay. And Paul, how about you?
I'm just glad to be able to be here, and look forward to next time.
Hope you're feeling better next week, Paul.
Oh, I appreciate that.
Mike?
Thank you ever so much. Like I say every week, this just charges my batteries for the rest of the week. I kind of wish we could do this 2 or 3 times a week, to be quite honest with you. And to give you a plug, I know of several people that won't join the chat. They won't ever tell you, but they've told me in private conversations and emails and such, we've got an audience, guys, and I'm pleased for that.
Well, I'm glad they find it beneficial and share with us and that. Yeah.
He didn't say they found it beneficial.
It's like Paul and I were musing. We wonder if there's someone out there listening just to find fodder, and like me teaching evolution. Go ahead, Wayne. Any thoughts?
Once again, I'm just glad to be part of this study. It's always an encouragement to be able to study with others who are like-minded, proclaimers of the faith. So thank you all.
Well, we appreciate you, Wayne, very much. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and Lord willing, if all goes well and the creek don't rise or whatever else might hinder our areas, we'll plan to continue our discussion next Wednesday at 11 o'clock a.m. Central Time.
That'll be noon in the Eastern Time Zone.
9 a.m. Pacific Time.
10 a.m. Mountain Standard Time.
Anyone else?
5 a.m. in Fiji.
Right here at live.truthfactor.com. Have a wonderful week.